So in this video, we're going to talk about how to beat critiques when you're affirmative. There's going to be some overlap between KAFs and with policy AFs, but no, for the most part, this lecture is geared towards people who are reading a policy AF, although the same concepts generally apply. So most of the time, people will tell you that you should use the POSTAL formula for answering a critique. The perm, the plan, and the alt can be done at the same time successfully. Uh, it's a way to test whether the alt solvency is prohibited via the link that occurs to the plan. Or to put it a different way, does the link prohibit alt solvency? That's kind of the way to kind of look at it there, because if it doesn't prohibit alternative solvency, then there's a question of, well, could the permutation be done at the same time? Then there's offense in the postal thing, which is what are some disads to the alternative, whether it's like a transition war, omnicide, some sort of argument that occurs just in a world of the alternative, not necessarily in the world of the AF. Solvency, why can't the alternative solve? The AF, the question is like, can the alternative result in the solving the advantages of the 1AC, or is that something that wouldn't be able to occur? And there's theory arguments. There are theoretical reasons why people think critiques are bad, whether it's framework, utopian alts, individual fiat bad. There's been a slew of different arguments that have been made throughout time. Uh, Alternative, the alt can't solve the links, i.e. can't provide uniqueness for the critique, and so you just have non-unique impacts that are being talked about on the criticism, which then AFs would leverage to be able to say that you should weigh the non-unique impacts as basically inevitable, and so you should try to do what you can to be able to solve some sort of impact, which is vote for the AF. And then the link debate, you would talk about how the plan doesn't link to the criticism of the one in C. Sometimes people will argue that the link portion of postal actually means that you should argue that the alt actually links back to the one in C link argument. That one's a little bit harder to do, but like there's a link debate that's going on. You're trying to force a stasis point or a point of differentiation between the 1AC and the 1 in C critique alternative. I don't like that model. Here's why. The first reason is that it requires a lot of arguments and a whole bunch of cards. And this just isn't really possible in this sort of world, because starting in about 2015, 2014, teams started reading critiques that were like one card or two very short cards, and being able to get critiques out in like a minute 20 inside of the 1 in C. So it made it very difficult for affirmatives to make 7 arguments in the 2AC onto that critique in a 60-second or 90-second time period of time, which means that the time trade-off was always really bad. And so that's the reason why these very short critiques started being read. And honestly, a lot of teams started reading the critique not because they were going to go for it, but because they would get a really good time trade-off off of that sort of mentality or approach to the debate. And so the first reason that I don't think postal is a particularly great way to go about things is there's just a whole bunch of arguments that have to be made. You don't necessarily have time for it. The second reason is that the majority of critiques do not come down to those arguments. Like, most of the postal formula just is irrelevant in a debate. And it is such a small percentage of debates that are won on those arguments that there's not a very high return on investment. Again, this is not meaning that you cannot win a debate on those arguments. It's just that those arguments are so unusually they're not successful. They're so not successful that the return on investment isn't there. And so it's not worth making those arguments. And then the third reason is I think that critiques have evolved, and I would probably mark the 2007 portion of college debate as sort of the marker as to when the evolution of alts and the way that critiques started working inside of the debate changed. early in Kritiks sort of existence, they talked about something structural in the world, and so they were structural critiques. If you've watched the other video about the different types of critiques that exist, they were usually structural in some sort. They were some sort of hierarchy's bad. We need to be able to sort of transform those sort of structures that exist. Or they were like epistemology arguments with rejectionals. They had some sort of like pragmatic, very easy way for the critique alternatives to provide uniqueness. Well, now those things don't really exist in that way. Between role of the ballot, role of the judge, framework arguments, critiques oftentimes function in a very different way, and because they function in that different way, those arguments don't usually get you much. Like arguments that get you to the point where you get to say the alternative can't solve or it's a non-unique dissad don't really get you very far in those debates. Instead, the debates usually get framed differently. And so, because of those different sort of framings about the education that is produced in the round, the epistemologies that are existent in the round, the ontologies that sort of exist in the round, and the ethicality of those ontologies, led to a very different sort of critique that's been debated over the last 20 some odd years. And so, as a result of that, I'm not sure that POSTAL fits in the current day realm of the way critiques are read anymore. And so, it's time to adapt for those three reasons. So, I prefer what is oftentimes taught as the counterplan method of answering, which is the SPOT model. The first is solvency. The alternative can't solve the AF, which should be pretty easy. You should have some solvency cards why the action of the AF is required for the solvency of the advantages. A permutation. The alt and the AF can be done at the exact same time. Obviously, that's going to get nuanced a little bit. Offense, you're going to be impact turning the alt in one way or the other. And then some theoretical reasons. Most people prefer framework here, but there are the laundry list of other things. You just see it's a more condensed down version. And oftentimes, I will tell my debaters if they are slow and can't keep up with fast debaters that the SP are the two most important ones. And I'll explain why I think the S and the P are the most important. Well, because the first thing that you have to understand about the solvency argument is that the solvency argument is essentially saying that the case outweighs. That's the argument you are going for. And there needs to be a reason why the alternative can't solve the AF. This is usually going to be baked into your solvency cards as to why some sort of government action is necessary in order to be able to win those arguments. And I think that there are critique tricks that exist that you can be able to beat them in order to get the solvency stuff. So when you go for the solvency debate, there are three key things you have to win. So if you look at subpoint 3 here, these three subpoints are the important part of the solvency debate. This is how you are going to win the debate on the case outweighs. First of all, you are going to make an epistemology argument. You are going to say that your theory of power or your epistemology is accurate and correct. A lot of critiques like to use these tricks in order to get rid of the AF via these epistemology arguments or their theory of power and the historicity being wrong for the affirmative and having a different root cause of sort of how the impacts are going to play out in the world. So if you can win that your AF has an accurate prediction in the round via your epistemology and via your theory of power, then you are going to be able to access your AF and prevent that K trick from nullifying the 1AC. The second thing is the magnitude debate. What is the biggest impact in the round? A lot of times, policy AFs are going to want to go for extinction outweighs. And so you need those arguments in order to be able to control the magnitude debate. There are lots of critique debates that AFs can win a majority of the debate, but if they don't win the magnitude debate, they will lose. This is particularly prevalent in things like the cap debate, because there are really good pieces of evidence that indicate that capitalism is unethical and must be rejected in every instance. And if they have shifted the magnitude debate to be that it is the primary concern and the primary impact is avoiding capitalism, then even if you win an extinction argument, it's not going to get you anywhere. And so the extinction magnitude debate is of the utmost concern, and so you need to read your evidence that says that protecting life is important. There's always a value to life, and that extinction outweighs. So that entire debate has to play out. I would nuance here to say that a lot of arguments that make ethicality arguments are some sort of value to life argument. They're not always value to life argument, but there is play in the warrants as to why it is unethical. And so when you look at that pieces of evidence, if you can win that life always has meaning and should always be protected via the value to life debate, then you're going to be in good shape to be able to on point answer that unethicality argument and then supplement that with your extinction outweighs arguments. The last part of this subpoint is that debate leaves the room. You need evidence that indicates that the education that you produce in the debate is good education and transforms society and or the government action that exists. If you can win those arguments, even if they win any framework arguments they are going for, if you win the debate leaves the room, you still have access to your AF without having to make a framework argument. You get your AF if you win. That debate leaves the room, because then you can argue that the education that's produced in the round mobilizes the change that is necessary for the government or society to change to solve the impacts, and therefore you get to leverage your case impacts against the critique. This is the most effective argument against critiques. In fact, I judged a whole bunch of college debate rounds, and one time I was talking in the post round with a very good first round OU team after we had judged them, and I was like, so, I think I was explaining to the other team because they were a lot younger, and it was a preset debate, and I was like, hey, what do you think the most effective argument is? And they're like, well, case outweighs. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking, because they were like 90% of these debates that we lose, when we do lose, comes down to one argument alone, and that is the case outweighs. And so if there's a formula for you to be able to win case outweighs, it puts you in a very good spot in order to be able to answer any critique, even if you don't know what the critique says. If you can defend that your AF is good, avoiding extinction is good, and that you have your hands on the levers of power and debate leaves the room and we can change the world, then you are going to be in great shape against pretty much every criticism that's out there. I think this is a better way to go about winning and leveraging your AF against a criticism. And the reason is twofold. One, judges want to be able to hang their hat on something. This method allows there to be cards that are read, and when there are cards read, judges feel a lot more comfortable being like, hey, this argument right here is made in this piece of evidence, therefore I vote on it. And they will hang their hat on those pieces of evidence. The second is that framework debates are often very hyper-technical and will always have some sort of judge intervention, whether it's because they didn't flow everything, they didn't recognize an argument that you were making, so they kind of skipped over it because of how fast you were going, or whatever the reason. There's oftentimes judge intervention at some level when you're having a deep, intricate, fast theory debate. And so framework debates are harder to win consistently, especially against people who are better than you, than this method. This method allows you to, quote-unquote, punch up against more talented debaters more often. And so these arguments also have sort of are better, which is number 6, which is sort of they have the assumptions of society already baked into them. Society and people, i.e. your judges, usually believe that predictions can be weighed, extinction outweighs, and we can influence the political process and how political policies are made. So most of society and most of your judges require the critique team to prove the opposite to be true. Then you have to prove those arguments true. And so when you get to, it makes their life a lot harder on the neg with their critiques if you go for these arguments. So I think this is sort of the secret way that you beat critiques, because if you can win these three arguments, you are going to be in very good shape. Second thing is the permutation. First reason why you might make a permutation is that if they're sort of quote unquote add-ons that could be read to a transition away from whatever the criticism is talking about. For example, cap. If you have an argument that says a transition away from cap causes world peace, you don't want world peace to be leveraged against your AF because you didn't make a permutation. So it prevents the block from just standing up and saying, here is a multiplicity of reasons why the alternative is good, regardless of the link in the impact debate. It just has its own intrinsic benefits. The permutation will allow you to suck those up and make the debate go back to a question of the case outweighs debate. And that's where you kind of want to be if you can see the previous slide before. It allows the debate to be focused around the impacts of the solvency deficit of the perm to the alt versus the solvency deficit of the alt to the plan. i.e., you get to weigh the alternative being ineffective because of the inclusion of the plan, i.e., the permutation does not solve all of the alt and whatever impact to that solvency deficit is, versus the solvency deficit of the alt cannot solve the AF. So, what has a bigger impact? And it allows you to get back to the question of what is the biggest impact? How can I win that my case outweighs? It gets you back in a spot where the solvency deficit, i.e., the alt cannot solve the AF, and that impact outweighs the lack of solvency of the permutation because the plan indicts or prevents alt solvency somehow. That functionally gets the debate back to the question of, does the case outweigh? And when you are a policy team, especially, this is the place you want to be. Third reason that you might make a permutation is because the double bind argument is pretty good. Where you get to, if the alt is making some sort of change to the world, then the double bind argument becomes very effective because either the alt can't solve, which makes their arguments non-unique, and therefore the case impacts outweigh, i.e. do something good if those impacts are going to be inevitable no matter what, or the permutation solves because linking one more time won't be a problem for the alt. I.e., when you critique capitalism, there are so many things that are capitalist inside of our society. Why would one more AF being added on top of that actually prevent the transition away from capitalism? Asking that fundamental question is the double bind. Would it actually prevent the transition away from capitalism? Probably not. So the permutation solves, or the alt was never going to be able to solve anyway if it could be derailed by one more capitalist policy that exists. Typically, I would say that this is not a strat that you should go for, but it is a strat that is winnable. Because, like it says on number one, it does have a benefit and is something that should be in every 2AC, especially because the word economy of permutation do both, and permutation do the plan and the alt in every other instance, or whatever variation of like the two permutations you like, are very good. So there's a very low risk, high reward in making permutations because of number one alone. But number four is still true. It oftentimes won't work because there are just an absurd number of links that can be made to a criticism. And so to straight up win the perm debate without like the solvency question that's talked about in number two, it becomes very, very difficult, and it has a low return on investment because you have to answer every single link argument that was made. And in good debaters, oftentimes will, if they're afraid that the permutation is going to be the debate, then they will spend the entire 1 and R just making link arguments. And that will be the entire 1NR is just link arguments. And if that happens, that becomes a very difficult 1AR to have happen when you're trying to straight up just be like, there is no link to the AF. And it makes it really difficult. So permutation as a way of saying there is no link to the AF is very difficult, very problematic. However, if you look at some of the other strategies and sort of benefits to the permutation, it's still something that should always be made in 2AC. Offense. Usually this is going to, this big caveat is there. There are a number of debaters who will win impact turns to a criticism, but they will forget to extend or win the magnitude debate. And because they don't win or engage on the magnitude question of what is the biggest impact in the round, then their impact turns really don't serve any purpose. And if their impact turns don't serve any purpose, because there's no magnitude, they're not an internal link to an impact that matters, it's going to lead to a lot of L's, and that's not where you want to be. So, if you go for impact turns, usually remember that you're going to have to accompany those impact turns with the impact in magnitude question that is going on as well, and it allows you to go for those extinction outweighs always a vital life sort of arguments. I think there are 3 different types of offensive arguments you can make inside of a K debate. The first is a disad. Why does the alternative produce something bad to happen? Basically, you are making the argument that something bad will happen in the world of the alternative. You don't necessarily have a reason why the AF can solve it, so it doesn't really have any uniqueness. So you can't go for it as like an add-on advantage, but you can go for it as something bad that would happen if the alt were to be done. The second one is like a method or theory of power impact turns. You can make arguments that the epistemology that the AF has is good, and that there are disads to it not being used. So if your 1AC engages in a bunch of science epistemology, and your theory of power is based around science, and that's how you understand the world and how it gets manipulated, then you can use that epistemology as a disad to the alternative and be like, the alternative does not engage in scientific method. Because it does not engage in the scientific method, XYZ impacts are going to occur. Those are all bad. And then the last one is sort of standard impact turns. They say cap is bad, you say it's good. They say state is bad, you say it's good. And then you can just have a normal impact turn debate with your parallel impact turns and your straight impact turns, and you can just have that debate and have a highly technical, fast debate on that. Okay, theory arguments. Framework is obviously debate. I have other videos about framework and my thoughts on framework that you can watch that are on this webpage, so you should go ahead and do that. There's also floating picks are bad. And a floating pick is when the alternative can result in the plan. So if the plan is to disarm nuclear weapons, does the alt result in a disarmament of nuclear weapons? If yes, that is a floating pick because it solves the actual AF, it does the AF, but it usually does it for different reasons. And usually when there's a floating pick, that criticism is criticizing the reason or the rationale behind, in this instance, disarming nuclear weapons, and says that it should be done for a different rationale, but can still be done. And that leads to a whole long list of like theory arguments about how it forces the AF to debate against itself, etc., etc. So a lot of like picks bad arguments can be made here. No text to the alternative. This doesn't happen too often anymore, but if the alt doesn't have a specific text, you can argue that that causes a vagueness to occur in the debate and prevents permutations, prevents in-depth debate as to whether the alternative would be a good idea or not. Utopian fiat is just the argument that the alternative fiats the world to be way too good, and that it's almost the equivalent of fiating world peace, and how world peace should not be something that the AF has to evaluate itself against because it is not something that is real world possible. It doesn't have any pragmatic reality based upon it. Vague alt, same sort of thing. Sometimes you will get a alt text, but it doesn't really mean anything. And so you can make some vagueness arguments about how it makes it impossible to debate them and how they get to shift the debate. And the 2NR means they always dodge and avoid 2AC offense and blah, 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 blah. So you can make those sort of arguments there. And then there's also individual fiat bad, this which is much more of an old school argument, but it says that you do not get to fiat the mindset of people because the AF does not get to fiat the mindset of people. And it allows you to do a lot more utopian things when that happens. And so there's again, with most theory arguments, there's a large overlap between the different sort of impacts and internal links that can be had from those theory arguments. And again, this isn't any exclusive list, but it is definitely a list that is some of the arguments that you can make on the theory part of it for spot. And so at the end of the day, I think the spot model is the way that you should go about answering a critique. You want to go for, and I hope in this video you understand that I think that the solvency portion of the debate, i.e. the alt cannot solve the AF, and the AF outweighs the critique, is probably the best way to go, especially if you are a policy team. The results will kind of differ a little bit if you are a critique team, depending on how your theory of power works and sort of its interactions with whatever K is being read. However, as a general rule, that should always be a play that is an option for the 2AR to go for, because it is an effective one. Permutation and offense, impact turns, disadds to the alt, etc., and theory arguments that we sort of briefly went over. And so in this video, we talked about the spot method, and hopefully that helps you answer critiques. And if you focus on the solvency portion of the debate and use that formula discussed in that video, you do not have to know what the critique is saying. And if you don't have to know what the critique is saying, it makes your life a lot easier because you just defended the AF.